Hi everybody, joining me today we have Dr. Monique Borgerhoff Mulder. She is trained as a social anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh and received the Ph.D. at Northwestern University. After a postdoc at the Evolution and Human Behavior program at the University of Michigan, she joined the UC Davis Anthropology Evolutionary Wing faculty, where she is now a distinguished professor. Dr. Mulder, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Just out of the dentist office, so I hope this is going to be nicer than the dentist.
Well, I hope so. At least we're going to talk about your intellectual interests. So. Okay, so to start off with, and because this interview is also mostly directed at the general public, could you please explain to people what is evolutionary anthropology? Because I mean, it works, at least as far as I understand it, at the intersection of culture and biology, right? While trying to understand human behavior.
Yes. It's quite difficult to classify, unfortunately. In anthropology, we typically have cultural anthropology, we have archaeology, we have paleoanthropology, and quite often we have linguistics as well. And you might sort of say, well, where does, and of course biological anthropology, sorry, I forgot the main one. You might sort of say, well, where does evolutionary anthropology fit in there? And it's difficult because actually we fit into all of them. The distinguishing feature of evolutionary anthropology is that we use theory derived from Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection to explain whatever we're looking at. It could be language evolution, it could be the behavior of people in contemporary societies, like looking at conservation issues. It could be looking at the paleo record, how tools get replaced and change over time. It could be to do with the archaeological record, how cultures and civilizations have increased and declined. So we're really hard to classify. We cover, by using evolutionary theory, we cover all of the areas of interest to anthropologists.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I guess we'll try to get in these areas to at how human behavior and psychology develop. So and in one of the articles you sent me, you talk about the differences between, for example, evolutionary psychology, which posits that at the basis of human behavior are sort of cognitive modules that were adapted to deal with the environment we evolved in, which is usually called the evolutionary environment of adaptation. And on the other hand, we also have human behavioral ecology, and you also do work in this area, right? So, which studies how human behavior is adapted to a certain environment, as well as conditional strategies humans might develop to deal with their particularities. So, how would you say we could work around the constraints that these two areas have and try to join them together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the article, it's terrible when you ask scientists about their articles because they normally forget them after they write them. But I think you're referring to something that I wrote with co-authors quite a long time ago. There was indeed a big divide between what we call evolutionary psychologists and human behavioral ecologists, focusing, as you suggested, sort of us focusing more on fitness, how people maximize their fitness, whereas evolutionary psychologists are more interested in the kind of evolved psychological modules, cognitive modules whereby people make decisions. And back at the beginning of this century, we fought a lot. I'm not regretting the fight, because I think that a lot of the early evolutionary psychology was very simplistic, and by not considering fitness consequences of individuals, they ran the risk of sort of adaptationist storytelling. You find some behavior, you say, well, you know, in the past there may have been a module that would have been well adapted to deal with such and such a problem. And it seemed like a very slippery way of doing science. And so we were more concerned with actually going out and looking at behavioral variation and looking at the fitness consequences associated with it, of course, mainly correlational. So nowadays, that debate, I think we think about that debate more in terms of the speed with which people can respond or update their behavioral preferences, update their behavioral decisions in response to changing environments, whether it's changing natural environments or environments that change as a result of the behavior of our own species. And so those arguments, while they were relevant at the time and I think helped to clear up some of the conceptual issues that were dividing us, are somewhat outdated now, insofar as lots of people are really interested to show how, for example, there has been genetic change within the last 10,000 years, sometimes more recently as a result of agriculture. There's obviously a huge amount of cultural change, and we're just much more interested in the dynamics of change rather than postulating that everything is just an adaptation to, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, whatever it was called. So I think that debate is past now, but it was useful.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, and now to talk a little bit about gender roles and sex differences in terms of behavior. So, for example, recently I had a conversation with Dr. Richard Lippe from California State University, and at a certain point I asked him if he could give me some examples of sex differences that he would consider to be the result of pure cultural construct. So, in other words, examples of how men and women behave that are completely the result of the influence of culture on their behavior, whatever it might be. So, and he said he couldn't name anything in particular because even culture has psychology at its basis. So, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I think he gave a very good answer. I mean, we're all aware, I think, even the general public are aware now that the debate of genes versus environment is obviously a ridiculous debate. The two interact in incredibly complex times, over evolutionary time and over ecological time. And I would say exactly the same for genes and culture. You know, the classic example is, baking a loaf, where, when you take the loaf out of the oven, how much of it is to do with the yeast, how much of it is to do with the flour, how much of it is to do with the fat. It's really hard. That's so the fact he couldn't give an answer is, it shows he's made a very sensible decision, in my view, or he'd get himself in big trouble. But I mean, to now not to dodge the question entirely, I think that people are beginning to think of increasingly creative and sophisticated ways in which we can maybe try to tease apart, to some extent, the role of evolved cognitive modules. Obviously, we do have an evolved brain. I mean, we can't deny that. And how it interacts with the world in which we find ourselves. And so as people think more carefully about the design of adaptations. You know, one of the problems with straight behavioral ecology has been that it's kind of black boxed. We just look at kind of the behavior. We don't really care how people got there, and that of course is stupid. And so we should be looking much more at the role of information, how we process information, and how this intersects with our cognitive kind of modules or cognitive habits. And people are doing this across the social sciences. You know, lots of economists, behavioral economists are doing this now. Evolutionary psychologists are doing it. Behavioral ecologists are cultural evolutionists, people interested in social learning. So I think we're really at a very exciting time that maybe that question can be unpicked, but it'll never be unpicked in a kind of percentage explained. It'll be unpicked with complex models that try to depict the interactions of these of sort of postulated mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So, and to talk a little bit about the studies you've done with the Pimbwe in Tanzania, do you think that what you collected in terms of information about how men and women behave there, the gender roles, and how they make decisions in terms of mating and sexual selection, do you think that things that come from those studies could add, let's say, a certain nuance to the way we think about gender roles?
I hope so. Certainly not just my work. A lot of people have been questioning for a long time the kind of stereotypic gender roles that are projected or that are predicted from simple models of sexual selection. But of course, it's always nice to have empirical data. I think that the interesting sex roles that I find there, that women have just as high variance in reproductive success as do men, and that women switch mates frequently. In fact, women benefit from switching mates in a way that males don't. Certainly, well, it's very explicable in terms of the environment in which the Pimbwe live. It's a very poor rural community in western Tanzania where livelihoods are very unstable, due both to climatic and conditions of the soil, also political, economic. The Rukwa Valley has been heavily underinvested in for really the last 100 years. Even the early colonialists all kind of avoided that area. And in addition, much of their original territory was taken away through various conservation interventions over the last century, such that people's livelihoods are difficult. To hunt and fish now is hard. You can get arrested if you go in the wrong places. And there's just a lot of problems with food insecurity, political security generally. So all of which means that women making decisions over a mate are very different from at least the classic formulation that sort of women choose, you know, wealthy, successful, tall, whatever men. It's really hard to predict how a guy will be doing in 5 years or 10 years. And, you know, maybe if he does really well with his tobacco crop, he'll invest in a gun, and then he'll go into the national park and get caught for poaching, and then he goes to prison, he comes back really sick. So, you know, it's just hard to predict these things. And I think those kinds of ecological and social circumstances unsurprisingly generate much more facultative sex roles than we've been, you know, I mean, than we've conventionally thought about as evolutionary or certainly as evolutionary psychologists. I think probably, you know, for people now sort of being raised in the sort of gig economy, you know, nothing here is particularly new. Many of the conditions of Pimbwe are affecting the West as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, and what would you say is the importance of sexual selection in terms of its contribution to sexual dimorphisms?
Yeah, that's a good question and a difficult one. Um, I mean, clearly we're, like every other species, we're subject to sexual selection. We see differences, obviously physiological, morphological, certain kinds of cognitive differences, which are obviously a result of sexual selection. But I think sexual selection theory is a heavily contested area within evolutionary biology. And many of the relatively simple models that have been produced over the years are now contested, partly on empirical grounds because predictions aren't met, but also on conceptual grounds. Sexual selection is very different from natural selection. Natural selection is just you against the environment. It's relatively easy for a theoretician to kind of predict, how many eggs you should lay, or how long you should stick around eating before the predator gets close, or whatever. Well, easy, not that easy, but it's relatively straightforward. Sexual selection, you're playing against other individuals who are also playing their optimal strategies as well. You're playing not just as a female, you're playing not just against other females, you're also playing against males. And so the predictions are highly volatile. And I think what we're beginning to learn is that many of the simple predictions that were, say, derived from Treversian kind of early behavioral ecology, I mean, wonderful as they were, they set the field really rolling, are grossly oversimplistic, particularly for a highly facultative behavioral species like us who live in so many different environments and such different political systems.
Mm-hmm. And now about reproductive skew in humans. So it has a relation with, for example, parental and maternal investment, the type of pair bonding, male cooperation, and etc. So in what ways do these aspects and maybe others influence reproductive skew?
Well, as I think maybe I sent you, we have a recent paper on that that's not published yet, which shows we compare reproductive skew in humans to non-human social mammals. This is a large group of people from the Nimbios, Kentucky group. And we find sort of unsurprisingly human sex differences in reproductive skew. So that's kind of the variance in male reproductive success sort of divided by or minus the variance in female reproductive success. We find that compared to other social mammals, we are relatively sexually egalitarian, say compared to red deer or something like that. Well, yeah, a lot of species. But but your question was more about mating systems, and one of the things we find in humans, well, actually we find it in the other mammals as well, is that mating system, I mean, you would predict that polygynous systems would have higher sex differences in reproductive skew than monogamous systems, and yeah, we do find it, but it's really weak, and this is consistent with the work, a lot of the work coming out of non-human behavioral ecology, that when you really sample the whole lifespan, when you really make sure you get a full sample, you're not missing the unsuccessful males or the super successful females or whatever, that you're really doing the work systematically and well, sex differences in skew are often not as large as they kind of initially were believed to be. And one of the interesting things with respect that came out of this paper that we haven't really quite got our heads around yet, although we're sort of doing some modeling to try and work out what's going on, but is actually in polygynous in humans, if you look at polygynous populations that allow polygyny, males have higher skew than females, which is sort of not surprising because they can marry multiply, whereas females typically can't. But actually, if you look at females, you get higher skew. It's just looking at females, not sex differences. You get higher skew in the polygynous. Sorry. higher skew in the monogamous populations than the polygynous ones. And it kind of makes sense that, although it hasn't really been looked at carefully before, but the idea of polygyny is that women sort of assort themselves effectively according to sort of an ideal free model amongst males. And so females will always sort of be reaching sort of the Nash equilibrium, that they're, you know, trying to make the best decision for themselves possibly. So that would serve to reduce skew. Whereas in monogamous situation, particularly if you have a highly stratified society, you know, some females are going to be much worse off having to marry a guy who's got many fewer resources, less able to keep her kids alive or whatever. So there's people haven't really looked at sex differences and skew very carefully, and I think it's something that we now have this big data set, and I think we're going to have to look at it much more carefully, both in relation to subsistence, but also in relation to mating system, as you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, and now that you touch on subsistence, in what ways do mating, parenting, and subsistence interact among themselves in, for example, the way people make decisions about investment in offspring and things like that? Yeah,
there's a lot of sort of widely held kind of wisdom on this, that, you know, monogamous, that hunter-gatherers, for example, are mainly monogamous, the pastoralist and some horticultural societies are very polygynous, and that agricultural societies, particularly intensive agricultural societies, are less polygynous. Also, of course, classic cases of very limited resources, for example, in parts of Nepal and Tibet, where you get polyandry because there's resources are so limited. Males basically team up with brothers and share a wife. So all of that is quite well sort of described at in a relatively loose sense. We depend on labels, how the ethnographer described the population he or she was studying. As to the marriage system, we often don't really know how polygynous it was, or whether monogamy is actually serial monogamy, and that could be polygyny, but it could also be polyandry if women are marrying again. So there's a lot of problems with the labels. Also, the subsistence categories were maybe adequate for sort of quote-unquote traditional societies, but increasingly we're all struggling with how to define, when we do comparative work, how to classify our populations. What is the principal livelihood? You know, how can we really describe it? So those stereotypes hold, and they're probably true if you half close your eyes, but I think we need to think quite a lot more carefully about these things.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so you also studied how the number of mates and the number of years spent with each mate influence fitness. That is to say, how successful people are in terms of reproduction. So in what circumstances did you study these, and what results did you get?
Oh, okay. So this goes back to the Pimbwe, who are, I'll use one of these labels, a horticultural population, but who also fish and hunt and do some commercial crop production in western Tanzania near Lake Tanganyika, near the border with DRC. The motivation there, just to give some background, was partly building off something I was talking about earlier, these kind of stereotypes of different sex roles, and a very strong set of principles in sexual selection theory is Bateman's principle, so that males will have higher variance in reproductive success than females, they'll have higher variance in number of mates than females, and that their mating success will be a better predictor of fitness for males and females. And I really wanted to explore those more because I realized that the Pimbwe people did not really fit those stereotypes very well. And in doing that work and in reading more carefully the sexual selection theory in non-humans and the sort of theoretical developments, it became clear that measures of mating success were really different. Different people use different things. They do it, measure in different ways. And it struck me that actually trying to sort of think about, particularly given that in the Pimbwe we found that male and female reproductive and mating success variants were totally identical. You just can't put a hair between them. However you run it and bootstrap the data, they come out the same. And so, I wanted to kind of kind of sharpen our gaze rather than just kind of talk about mating success, break down mating success into different components. And of course, when you talk about this, you talk about it as if you're guided by theory, and I was driven by theory, but of course I was also very aware of the empirical circumstances. I kind of knew what was going on, and so it guided me to this idea of looking both at, and this is coming back to the categories you mentioned, the numbers of years that you spend married, which for males can of course be more because they can be married to two women at the same time. In fact, polygyny doesn't work very well with a Pimbwe. Normally wives leave men pretty quickly, but they do, some men are polygynous for a certain amount of time, and actually interestingly it's increasing. So we're looking both at the number of years that you spent married and for men and women, and also the number of different individuals to whom you're married. Marriage is a very flexible term in Pimbwe. It's really kind of who you move in to live in a household with. There's not much of a celebration or not much ritual and no, well, they're kind of payments, but they're rarely made. So we had these two measures, and what we found, sort of consistent with Bateman's theory, is that men do benefit more in terms of their fitness from the number of years they spent married. There's a stronger association than there is for women. But then controlling for that in a model that has sort of all of this together, and actually a whole lot of other things as well I won't bore you with, we also look at the effect of the number of distinct, different individuals to whom you're married. And there the effect goes the other way, that women actually benefit more from multiple mates than do men. The effect is not as strong as the other one, but they're both definitely clear, distinct effects. And so this is kind of interesting because even though men and women have relatively similar fitnesses or variance in fitness, the paths whereby you can be successful are different for men and women. And that is, so that would then feed back into sexual selection theory in that, if these conditions had characterized humans for much of our human history, and, I don't want to presume that, although I don't necessarily want to presume it's not true, women would have been selected to be, men would have been selected to kind of acquire and retain mates, whereas women would be selected to switch mates more. They benefit more from that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in what ways do sibling interactions or sibling conflict even influence parental allocation of resources?
I don't know so much about that. I have written. I've written a paper called Brothers and Sisters, so I guess that was with the population I did my Ph.D. with, Kipsigis, a agro-pastoral population in Kenya. Certainly parents in those kinds of societies, so agriculture and pastoral populations where a lot of wealth is inherited, passed down from parents to offspring, it's not surprising that, yes, they do vary their investments depending on, like, for example, if a man's got a boy has got a lot of brothers, he's less likely to marry early, because it's harder for him to accumulate, that there's more competition over the bride wealth payments that are needed for the marriage. But whether that is actually due to a change in the parental strategy, or whether that's just an outcome because of greater stress on the resources, I'm not sure. So that's why I said I may actually have, that paper was written a long time ago. I may well have talked about it more in terms of parental investment, but I think it's probably the wrong thing to do. But I think more generally, we do know, David Lawson, for example, in a review paper, did nice work looking at how number of siblings, so I suppose the number of offspring you have influences, I suppose parental investment in other offspring. You could construe it that way. And certainly, I think the general pattern that we do know that's pretty clear is that having a lot of siblings, or if parents have a lot of offspring as hunter-gatherers or horticulturists, it doesn't have as negative effects on the outcomes for the children as if they have a lot of kids in a pastoralist or an agro-pastoralist or society. And that is, it's really to do with the rivality of the resources that are being passed down. If the offspring are competing for the parental resources, they're going to suffer more from having a large sib set than in a hunter-gatherer population, or maybe a horticultural population where land is pretty much unlimited, and then children born in large sib sets don't suffer. But the way you ask the question is how the parents change the behavior. And I do remember one thing about that brothers and sisters paper that I think is important point that kind of I drew out of it, that we've got to be really careful separating outcomes that we see on offspring or associated with offspring that might be associated with the size of the sibling set from strategic behavior of the parents. Often people find an outcome and then say, well, it's because the parents are investing more and they're investing less or making strategic decisions. And I think that's a kind of really kind of messy area that I'm not sure has really been cleaned up yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and now to go back to what we were talking about earlier about a number of years spent with a mate and the number of mates and etc. So according to evolutionary theory and then applied, of course, to evolutionary psychology, we predict that it would be a better reproductive strategy for men to be more promiscuous than women, because they don't get pregnant, they don't have to carry the child for 9 months, and usually they are not the primary caregivers. But even so, and because of what you said about perhaps it being a better reproductive strategy for men, they gain more from a higher number of years spent with the same mate. So I guess that what I want to ask here is how do we join together those two that information coming from evolutionary theory and that and those conclusions you had from your studies?
I don't find that difficult at all. I mean, that's precisely my point, that sexual selection is going to produce a highly facultative, flexible set of strategies. And so put a man down in Pimbwe with the cultural information that he has there and with the economic conditions, and it might pay him to behave very differently than put a man down in the Kipsigis area where I worked, where you can really, if you're lucky, if your dad gives you a lot of cattle and you've got land, you can really accumulate 4, 8, some guys even had 12 wives. So I just, I mean, it kind of sounds like a cop-out, but I just think that we're an unbelievably flexible, facultative species, added to by the fact that we have culturally transmitted information. So it's not, when I say put a man down in a place, obviously that would be kind of confusing. But, people can benefit from, the experiences and wisdom and lessons that their ancestors have learned from dealing with presumably somewhat similar challenges, although, of course, the world is changing now. It's kind of what we talked about at the very beginning, how rapidly we update our decisions. But culturally transmitted information is very useful to help buttress, in a sense, the kind of facultative flexibility that I'm talking about. But I mean, more generally, men's strategies have been rather ignored by, well, not just evolutionary anthropologists. I mean, evolutionary anthropologists just kind of always assumed, I mean, myself included, that, accumulate a lot of resources, go out and be competitive, acquire multiple spouses, that's great, because that's kind of what it looked like to me in the Kipsigis world. And demographers, of course, have rarely even collected data on men. All of the sort of modules that are conducted in national, international surveys, are always based on the reproductive histories of women, very rarely on men, although luckily this is starting to change. Because we really do need to understand much more about the variability in male strategies that has kind of been overlooked. I mean, people are always complaining, people never look at women, whether the behavioral ecologists look mainly at males and not at females. Well, at least they used to complain about that, no longer now. But really it's gone almost the other way now, that certainly with people working on humans, I think we need to understand a lot more about male reproductive strategies, because they face all the same trade-offs that females face with respect to time, resources, quality, quality of offspring, attempt to get yourself, your career and your income and all of that stuff ahead. So yeah. I don't have a good answer to that question, except that I don't actually think it's puzzling. I think we're just as facultatively flexible. Men are just as flexible as females are.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that could be explained via different ecological conditions, so that a certain kind of culture arises in where men and women are exposed to different environmental conditions, and so it wouldn't really be, it wouldn't necessarily be the case that men and women in different places have different sorts of cognitive modules, but they deploy them in different ways according to the environmental conditions they are exposed to.
Exactly. No, that you put it very, very clearly, and that's sort of what I was talking about at the very beginning, that this kind of split between psychologists and behavioral ecologists is really something we realize is not not necessary to emphasize. I mean, every problem is complex, and different people specialize in different aspects of how the problem can be solved. I suppose as anthropologists, we're just so interested in the diversity and the variability across the world that we just keep on wanting to go out and look at the variability and try to make sense of it, although we might not make sense of it in a very in a way that's very satisfying to a psychologist who might really want to understand the mechanisms better. And that's great. I mean, they should be understanding the mechanisms better, but as we all know, if they only do it in the sort of psychology 101 lab class, they're never going to get the full range, or maybe even a normal range of human behavior. So I think our methods are increasingly complementary, which is really great. I mean, it's an amazing area of interdisciplinary, where the borders and barriers between disciplines are breaking down, because we just understand human behavior is caused by so many different inputs, and different disciplines have different tools to examine those inputs.
Yeah, because if you only study people in the lab, then you get the weird problem, right? You only have access to psychology students
I know,
or something like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So and so one last question. How does your work and the work done generally in evolutionary anthropology contribute to de-romanticize the notion certain people have of hunter-gatherer societies and prehistorical peoples? Because I mean, and particularly during the last century, we got a lot of people saying, for example, that hunter-gatherers were not bellicose at all, that they didn't have strict gender roles, or at least as strict as we have in more developed societies, let's say, that they didn't explore their natural environments, that they didn't have rape, they didn't practice infanticide and things like that. So what would you say about that?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to people pointing out the danger of romanticizing any kind of societies, but particularly hunter-gatherers, I suppose. There's a whole sport in doing so, as you said. The violent stuff. Yeah, I mean, I know that recently there have been a lot of studies pointing to extremely high levels of interpersonal violence among hunter-gatherers, both in contemporary, but also, archaeological, paleo-archaeological finds of great massacres, and, people making the argument that, these people were really killing each other at massive rates. I just don't know. I don't know what to. I certainly don't want to commit the mythologizing that they were all peaceable. I'm absolutely sure that's not true. But I just don't really know. And I know a number of amazing papers have been brought out on attempts to estimate levels of violence. And I mean, I respect that people are trying to do this, but I think it's really hard to do. To make generalizations about a behavior that's relatively rare anyhow. If you find some great massacre site, does it really mean that was always going on? So I wouldn't really want to stick my neck out about levels of violence. And as with all of these subsistence types, whether it's horticulturalists, pastoralists, agriculturalists, any generalizations we make about them immediately have a million exceptions. We must have, as a species, we must have had very variable rates of violence in our history that would have been patterned in part by how we made a living, but by many other things as well. So I don't know quite what position I have there. But more generally about mythologizing and sort of glamorizing hunter-gatherers, for example, for sort of having a light ecological footprint, for being good conservationists, that's highly problematic. I mean, of course they have a light ecological footprint because of low population density, mobility, non-intrusive technologies, but the assumption that, once they're put in a difficult position, that maybe a national park is made in their land, or their river is dammed or something, of course they're going to overfish or overhunt in the area left. And then, of course, with modern medicine, their populations are growing. So they're just like everybody else. We make we don't overharvest things if we don't need to, but if we're desperate, of course we do, and of course we value the present more than the future because of classic rates of time discounting. So I entirely agree that these kinds of big sort of mythologizing is wrong, and And in addition, I mean, we have pretty interesting quantitative data where we did work across different hunter-gatherer, horticultural, pastoralist, and agricultural populations. We were interested in looking at rates of inequality. And, certainly pastoralists and intensive agricultures have higher levels of inequality if you measure them with something like the Gini coefficient, which is not great, but it gives you some idea. Certainly, in our sample, the pastoralists and the agriculturalists have very high rates. I mean, pretty much equivalent to the modern U.S. or South Africa or Britain, Italy as well. I think are some of the areas with the greatest inequality. But the rates of inequality amongst hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists were also quite notable. I mean, they were pretty much equivalent to, say, like the Nordic democratic republics of Scandinavia. So they weren't as egalitarian, at least on the kinds of things that they thought or they think are important, like things like your health or your hunting skill or the size of your family. So all of this is just to say that we should not mythologize about hunter-gatherers. And I think maybe even more important, we shouldn't make generalizations about different subsistence types, even though anthropologists, including me, have done it forever.
And so just about the violence rates, would you say then that when we gather data from archaeology, probably about violence rates in prehistoric peoples, that it is perhaps a bit speculative?
Well, this is not an area that I'm an expert in, so I venture nervously into areas that other people know much more about than I do. But I suspect it's difficult to make these kinds of, just to, with so many things that you calculate, it's quite easy to get something in the denominator, how many dead people, how many dead children or whatever. We're all pretty good at covering that. The denominator is really important when you want to get a rate right, but how many people are actually living, or what's your background rate, or your background exposure, people are exposed to the possibility of violence who didn't die on that day. It's difficult. I wouldn't want to say more than that, but I just there's all these arguments that sort of we're just getting more and more peaceable as a species. You've got to remember the denominator is growing enormously every year. There's more and more people in the world. You'd have to be killing an awful lot of people just to keep that ratio up. So. But as I said, I am beyond my area of competence here, so take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, fair enough. So just before we finish, Dr. Mulder, would you just like to share with people perhaps some interesting work you're doing right now? And I don't know if you're active on social media and perhaps other places people can follow your work. I'm unfortunately incredibly inactive on social media. I'm so ashamed of it. I mean, I keep up with some people, but I don't know, life just seems to be so busy doing what we have to do. And it's to my detriment, because I totally understand that scientists are, really, if you don't publicize your stuff, nobody reads it. So I collaborate with a lot of people who are much more active than me. But otherwise, no, I'm not very active myself. We are again in collaboration. A lot of my work now is in collaboration. We're doing this kind of cool stuff in why polygyny disappeared. We're sort of trying to model the reasons for the basically disappearance of polygyny across most of the world. And that will be stuff that will be coming out quite soon, hopefully. And my co-authors will no doubt tweet everything that we do.
And they'll find it like that. Or, I mean, I obviously have a web page and I do have a Facebook page and stuff, but I'm actually more active. I run quite a lot of conservation programs in Tanzania at our old study site in Rukwa. We now have conservation and development programs, and the Tanzanian managers there run active sites, and I'm kind of active with them. So it's not that I'm sort of withdrawing from social media. I'm just use it more for areas that I think are actually kind of more important, helping relieve inequality and poverty and environmental destruction in Africa. So that's kind of where I put most of my effort when I'm not doing all this work, which I really love as well.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Mulder, I think it was a great conversation, and I would really like to thank you for taking a bit of your time to be here with us today.
Great. Well, it gave me a chance to forget about the dentist, and it doesn't hurt as much now as it did, so that's good. Okay, thanks.
Great.
Bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.